Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Pearlman.
Hello. For the next half hour, we're going to be talking about the Middle East, especially the water issues in Israel and Palestine, with my guest, Dr. Frank Romano. He is an activist, writer, and actor, and he is a lawyer who is a member of the California Bar and also in France. He was formerly professor at the University of Paris, a lawyer in France, and he has been an actor and is in the lead role in the dramatic play Bonhoeffer, Last Days. He is also author of the book Love and Terror in the Middle East. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
My pleasure as well, Nancy. Thank you.
You've been involved in many different interesting issues, but let's begin with the current problem of water in the Middle East, because you were an eyewitness to an environmental disaster in the West Bank and Gaza. That is a matter of who has what water. And just as we have here in the Southwest agreements regarding water use for the Colorado River for different states, but yet we're overusing the water so that Mexico doesn't get the water, we have a similar situation based on the Oslo Accords back in the 1990s. Tell us what that agreement was supposed to do.
That agreement actually was supposed to set up a cooperation between Israel and Palestine, and Arafat signed it with the Israeli authorities. And in that agreement in 1993, that was the Oslo II Accord, Israel, on the right foot, recognized Palestinian water rights, and it was mutual. But the overall accord, to answer your question, was really to find peace between the Palestinians and Israel, and within 5 to 10 years, the land that Israel occupied, in particular Area C, would be returned to Palestine, and Palestine would be able to form its own state with cooperation, economic cooperation with Israel. That, unfortunately, that latter hasn't happened yet, but it got off to the right path, especially with the water rights.
According to the World Health Organization, people need a minimum requirement of daily per capita water consumption of about 100 liters. And yet the water in areas like Gaza is only an average of 88 liters.
That's right.
Whereas in Israel, it's more than 200. How is that happening?
And in the West Bank, it's a little bit more than 88. Per capita, there's 90.5 liters of use of water in the West Bank, but clearly under the 100 liters of water. And what per day, per person. However, that figure in the West Bank is a little bit stilted because that includes also the Palestinian businesses. That's supposed to be the personal use. So personal use of water is even lower than 90 liters per capita. What's happening here, it's not just about the Israeli government occupation of the land and also of the West Bank and the blockade. It also has something to do with the insufficient Palestinian infrastructure. The West Bank, for instance, Mekorot is Israel's national water company, is what they supply most Palestinian communities with water. About a third of that water going to Palestine is lost through leakage because of the pipes and the other conduits for the water. And the problem is, Nancy, and it comes to the politics of the Israeli government. I am working with many Israelis and activists against this policy, which is in line for it to keep its mandate, is in line with the large settlement communities. And the settlers have made it clear that they're really pressuring the Palestinians in different ways and the government. So one way they do it is they don't allow the government, through their political pressure, to approve the Palestinian Authority, which is the Palestinian government in the West Bank, to be able to improve the infrastructure, including the pipes, to get in materials to do that. So it works in line with the political situation in Israel And the settler overall goal really is to take more and more Palestinian land. If there's problems with the water, insufficient water that the Palestinians have access to, and more insufficient because their population has doubled since 1995, is the overall objective of the settlers. Not a lot of the Israeli Jews and the world Jews don't like this policy, wanting to pressure the Palestinians to leave their land, to leave their communities, with the help of the Israeli government, which has gone way to the right and very pro-settler. So this has become a political thing, unfortunately, and the victims of this is the Palestinians, because the settlers have almost unlimited access to water.
It's strange to me that Israel doesn't want to support fixing the infrastructure, stopping the leakage, because all the countries in the Middle East are in a desert where water is scarce, and they know how important it is not to lose water.
Oh, absolutely.
And it would be important everywhere to have a strong infrastructure to fix the leaking pipes.
You're right, and there are many Israeli activists and the Jews in the United States are trying to pressure the government and the settlers to pull back on their land grabs. Overall, with the water issue resolved, where the Palestinians are getting enough water to cultivate their lands, it would improve relations as well. Again, it's become politicized. I have a friend who's a U.S. professor and considered a Zionist, very pro-Israeli, but doesn't support what the settlers are doing. Several years ago, a personal friend of mine, he took a personal friend of a family that are very linked with me, a Jewish family that live in Jaffa, took a trip to all the settlements. He also visited Palestinian farmlands, and he made a comment. In spite of his very pro-Israeli stance, he said, there is more water in the exclusive swimming pools of the Israeli settlers than the poor Palestinian farmers have to cultivate their lands with. And he wouldn't have said that. He doesn't want to say anything that would be against the Israeli occupation of Palestine and so forth. But he saw that. Exactly what you said, the need to resolve water in these desert lands in the Middle East. And it would, again, improve relations between the Palestinians and the Israelis.
Israel has been extremely innovative in sustainable technology,
Absolutely.
Whether or not it is solar power or irrigation systems that they've developed so that water is not evaporated so much when fields are irrigated. And that traditional irrigation in the United States has been a real water waster. And Israel has changed that. Are they introducing that kind of technology throughout the region so that people can have more water simply by proper water use?
Absolutely, and what they're noted for, among other technology, and you have to give Israel credit for this. And a lot of the scientists in Israel are focusing on this and enhancing the technology, not just for Israeli Jewish youth. They really have in their hearts and their minds and their work to enhance access to drinkable and good water for the entire Israel, all of Israel and Palestinians, as well as the Middle East. But they have technology called drip irrigation, which has highest water efficient rate in agriculture. It reaches the 70 to 80% rate of efficiency, as opposed to open irrigation, which achieves about 40% efficiency rate, which is most systems, including the United States, use this open irrigation as opposed to drip irrigation. In other words, the drip irrigation involves the recycled use of water, wastewater, adding nutrients mixed in with the water, and desalinization are recent new innovation used to solve the problem of water scarcity in Israel and hence potentially the world.
There's also the issue of water quality. You point out that in some places the sewage is going into the aquifers or onto farmlands, which make it difficult and dangerous to use farmland that isn't polluted. Can you explain what is happening with the sewage?
Yes, and let's focus on Gaza first, because the aquifers, and this is not directly linked to the blockade, indirectly linked to the blockade of Gaza by Israel, but the main thing is their infrastructure in Gaza, in particular pipes coming from aquifers, desalinization plants to change salt water into potable drinking water. That water is contaminated itself because the infrastructure needs to be improved. 97.5% of the water that the Palestinians use in Gaza is impotable. They can't drink it. They bathe with it and do other things, but they can't drink it. And even the water that comes from the aquifers, as you talked about, has sewage mixed with it because of the same reason. Sewage is seeping in to their conduits, transmitting water from the aquifers and other sources because its aged infrastructure needs to be improved upon. Now, here is a problem with the blockade. The Israeli blockade of Israel doesn't permit a lot of construction materials coming in, and for one valid reason is the concern that those construction materials will be used by Hamas not for the infrastructure, but to build more weapons, including the rockets that are going into Israel. It's concerned about it. My idea was more monitoring, with work with Egypt. Hamas has water is not contaminated. That could be also a way of pressuring and keeping a minimum services to Gaza and making them weaker. The idea by the Israeli government is to weaken Hamas. I think it's not absolutely true that Hamas would not be interested in improving infrastructure with those materials like cement and so forth and pipes to pipe the water because his people are being contaminated.
Since some of the people are not getting the water that they need, they have to buy water.
Yes.
That hurts them economically.
Absolutely.
But where is that water coming from?
There's a lack of compliance complete with Oslo, and the Palestinians are getting 75% of the land amount of water, and their population is increasing, so they're getting less and less. Their consumption is much less per capita than the 100 liters required under the World Health Standards. Many of the Palestinians, to make up for it, have had to purchase the water from private sources, perhaps some from Ecuador, but from private sources, including the Palestinian Authority. We're talking about millions of gallons of water, and the private sources of water that the Palestinians are themselves individually purchasing the water, as well as the Palestinian Authority, tend to be very expensive, in particular when the source trucks are going over rough terrain. They're charged a lot of money, and it turns out to have a major impact on the economy, financial situation of the Palestinian families in particular, having to purchase this water to make up the lack of water for the lacks that we talked about.
People want water, need water, so there is also the system of people collecting rainwater. But climate change has affected how much rain there is, and so they're not getting as much rainwater. And this has to do with politics worldwide in terms of what we're doing about climate change, not specifically in this area, but it is affecting people not being able to collect rainwater.
Exactly.
What is happening there?
And that's huge. When you go into Palestine, you go into Israel, you have these big cisterns on the roof, and it collects water. Starting with Gaza again, they count on that water a lot to be able to use, to be able to drink, and to pump the water from the cisterns, from those big vats, those round vats we see on top of the roof. You need a pump. And now the issue with Gaza is they only get 4 to 3 and sometimes no electricity to run the pumps. So if the pumps can't be run, that water they collect from the rain cannot be used. They can't pump it down to their homes, and they don't have running water. They could try to dip it in and get some bottles full of it, but that doesn't really address the need to wash with and so forth. So the pumps aren't working. The problem with electricity is not just an Israeli government problem. There's a pressure from the PA, the Palestinian Authority from the West Bank, that's done a lot of politicking to pressure Hamas. It wants to create an issue in Hamas, in Gaza, so that people will turn around and revolt against Hamas, and that is a big issue about water usage. And the PA, Palestinian Authority from the West Bank, has a lot to do with working also with Israel to limit the electricity. So that's just one impact on electricity. Also about hospitals and things have to close down, and people won't get hospital care a lot. And just having 4 hours of electricity per day is, for many reasons, is a compass. But getting back to the water issues, that's a major thing. The West Bank, there are families that count also on the rainwater because these communities they're not connected with Mekorot, I said, with Israel's national water company, and the water pipes that are nourishing Palestine go to the settlements. Now the Palestinians are getting 75% less amount of water as agreed by Oslo, because twice they've doubled their population since 1995, since Oslo. However, the problem with that, 1/3 of that water that goes to the Palestinians is lost through seepage because of the lack of, same thing with Gaza, infrastructure, the pipes and so forth. And when the PA, the Palestinian Authority, claims that it seeks authorization to improve the pipe so it wouldn't lose so much water. It says it's not being authorized. It's another way the Israeli government pressures the Palestinians. They're not getting the water. They're losing a lot of the water and saying it has to do with the inefficient pipes supplied by the Palestinian Authority. So it works together. There's still that issue with the settlers, the settlements, pressuring the Israeli government to limit authorization for improving the infrastructure, and too bad kind of for the Palestinians because they're not getting water because they want the land. The rainwater, it becomes important in the summertime, however, and like you said exactly, Nancy, with climate changes, there's not so much rain, so they can't collect to overcome the fact that they don't get enough water through those pipes, the climate change issues. And especially that there's a problem in the summertime, however, because the summertime settlement use is increased a great deal, not just for the swimming pools, for other reasons. So Mekarot limits more water to the Palestinians in favor of the settlements getting more water. That's the problem of priorities and so forth that needs to be addressed. Again, politicizing water control and pressuring the Palestinians to leave and making their life difficult is not a good policy.
Does desalination play a role in providing water to both Israelis and Palestinians?
Yes, it does, especially in Gaza. Israel has amazing technology, and this is a beautiful, amazing technology that changes the water supply. But I know the aquifers and so forth in Gaza are nourishing the Gazans, but again, if a lot of that water is lost to insufficient infrastructure that they're not allowed to improve upon, like the pipes, and part of it is due to the Israeli blockade, then a lot of that desalinized water is being lost. That is potentially huge, Nancy, and if we can work it out and build up the infrastructure, both in the West Bank and Gaza, that is a major solution to water sources in those two areas, and in Israel as well.
We're going to talk more about water issues in the Middle East when we return in a moment with my guest, Dr. Frank Romano, who is a lawyer in both France and California.
Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman continues with further discussion of the world's critical ecological issues. For more information, you may call 310-559-9160 or go to www.ecoprojects.org. Now, here's Nancy.
I'm speaking with Dr. Frank Romano. He's an activist, writer, lawyer. You authored the book Love and Terror in the Middle East. Does that talk about these water issues?
As a matter of fact, it focuses more on building bridges between Israel and Palestine. It does address trying to do that. It doesn't even talk too much about the water issues. It might talk, the last chapter, I was in Kana Akmar, the Bedouin village, and I believe I talked about, I witnessed the Mean settlement discharging wastewater into the village, and they've been pressuring the Israeli government to kick out the Palestinians in this village again. It's called Kana Akmar, and it's in the corridor. It's east of Jerusalem, between Jerusalem and the Jordanian border. And that whole corridor area, settlements like Kafar Adamin and others are expanding there. And the issue with the Palestinians is sooner or later they're going to take over that central area and for all intents and purposes divide North and South West Bank, and not allowing the Palestinians from Jerusalem to get in and visit, and they have a lot of families in the West Bank because there's that corridor taken over. It turns out in that corridor between, again, Jerusalem and Jordan are many Bedouin villages, including Al-Kana Akmar, where I stayed, and I speak Arabic now. I'm trying to work with the Palestinians in a nonviolent way to pressure the Israeli government to allow them to exist. But the Israeli government is linked again with the settlers who wanted to push them out into Abu Dis, which is another Palestinian town near the dump there. There's a dump there, also a sewage processing center. And if they were to do that, the Bedouins, and since once or twice a year it's inundated with flooding, the land around that area would be flooded and they couldn't graze. Bedouins are essentially desert people, but they are not nomadic. These people are not nomadic. They have a permanent school in this village. That was a central part of the resistance to stop the Israeli government from destroying the Bedouin villages. I included that in my book. But in the middle of this protest movement, the settlers came down from Kafar Adamin and kind of stormed the village and so forth, and they were prevented from entering. And shortly after that, water started flowing from Kapa Adumim, sewage water and used water down into the camp. And what is the impact there? For 2 weeks, the water stayed. The Israeli government, again, which is working with the settlers to pressure the Palestinians to leave, including the Bedouins, allowed it to go on for 2 weeks. It could have cleaned it up that very same day, which is responsible to do that. Under international law for an occupied country, you cannot move them around and kick them out of their lands on a permanent basis and bring in permanently your own people to occupy this land. But the settlers to protest against the fact they were prevented from entering the village, allowed their sewage to go into the village. And I was seeing kids play near it, and it was smelling terribly. Kids were playing near it. We're not getting to the health issues, but I did see some of their donkeys and some of their sheep actually drinking the water, which could cause them to be sick. And the Bedouins depend upon their livestock to sell and to eat.
Obviously, everywhere in the world, we need to have clean water. We need to be sure that everybody has access to water, and that's a major international issue in more places than just the Middle East. We've been talking about the need for the people to have water, clean water, people in the entire area of Israel and Palestine, regardless of whether or not they are under the Palestinian Authority or the Israeli government.
Yes.
But what about the ecosystems, the wildlife? Don't they need the water too?
Absolutely. With climate change, of course, that has an impact on the ecosystems, of course. But apart from that, a lot of these lands, especially desert lands in the West Bank and Gaza, are nourished by water, by irrigation water. And this has an impact. If the irrigation water is not sufficient, the water coming from the pipes by the Palestinians that are supplied by Mekarot, the Israeli water source, then the ecosystem cannot be enhanced. They cannot water their farmlands and even the trees and flowers and so forth. It has an ultimate impact on the entire ecosystem. With water not getting there, some of the water being contaminated and the land being contaminated has a direct impact on the ecosystem.
Some places in this area are so famous, whether or not it's the Jordan River, the Dead Sea. Are these very famous water resources threatened with pollution, or are they threatened with having less water go into those bodies of water?
Yes, I'm more familiar, Nancy, with the Jordan River. And the Jordan River used to be a huge stream of water, a river that nurtured the entire area pretty much. But the water has been taken. In particular, I say that the Israeli government has more jurisdiction over it than anyone in that area, and a lot of that water is a source, for important water source for Israel and Palestine. It's reduced almost a trickle in some parts of the Jordan River because it's drying up. It really is, because of the use of the Jordan River. And of course, climate change also with not having enough rain to refurbish that river, to restore water to the river. It all connects, because the Palestinians that need more water, as well as Israelis, and the water is not coming through rain, they need more water from the river. And that has a huge impact on the Jordan River, and it's, like I say, it is starting to dry up. The Dead Sea is another issue. The Dead Sea water is shrinking. It has also freshwater aquifers on the perimeter of the lake, and it diffuses into deposits. The freshwater diffuses into salt deposits beneath the surface of the shoreline, but the water is also shrinking in the Dead Sea. It's not just due to the use of the water, but also to climate change and not having very much rain. But it is definitely declining like a meteor a year. Environmental groups say that it's a man-made ecological disaster. I think it's also linked to the scarcity of rain, the scarcity of resources in the area, and the overall use of this water, in particular by the state of Israel.
Israel is surrounded by many other countries. They're in a desert.
Yes.
Do they have similar water shortage issues due to climate change, lack of rainfall, due to other multinational, international conflicts between different countries and who has rights to the water?
Yeah. The water issue in the Middle East is overall grave and very important, and they're having the same issues, not just with climate control, but politicizing access to water is very similar. It's not just happening in Israel and Palestine and other parts of the Middle East.
You have lived and worked both in California and in France. You were formerly a professor at the University of Paris. You have been a lawyer there. You understand different laws in different countries and also these international agreements.
Yes.
Do we have the laws on the books to take care of some of these crises, or do we need more international agreements? Do we need more international enforcement?
That's a very, very important question. And I really think internationally we do have international law, United Nations and so forth. They have laws protecting water rights and so forth in a very general way. But it boils down basically to the agreements that we need to enhance. To answer your question directly, the agreement between the Palestinians and Israel, the Oslo Accord, we need to renegotiate these agreements, especially when we're talking about water rights and the way things are going now. Both the Palestinians are having issues, as well as the Israeli government, in keeping up the infrastructure to make sure that people have access to water. And it has a huge impact on the environment as well, not just the sewage, but also the Palestinians that are not maybe putting their own economic efforts into improving their own infrastructure. And with the seepage of the water and the sewage is contaminating their land is also their responsibility. The agreements need to be enhanced, and we need to put teeth more into these agreements and more monitoring. Countries could monitor, connected with the UN or not, to make sure that the environmental issues are addressed and people have access to water. So to answer your question, there are general international law standards protecting the environment worldwide, but we need more specific laws and in particular negotiated agreements between regions such as Palestine and Israel and Gaza and so forth to specifically address access to water and cleanup and environmental issues that are not being properly addressed within those agreements.
You have also won a case in California that set a precedence. You won a labor law case in France, going to court to help people win their rights under the various laws of the countries. What are some of these important court rulings?
Yes, that simply allowed us to have due process rights. Even when you're in prison, you have some rights. The labor law case was a lady who was subject to moral discrimination and harassment in court. But in the lower court, to make it very short, refused the case because it was a procedural error that the lower court attorney made. I got the case on appeal, and I simply said to the appellate judges, there's a precedent in the case. I realize that you cannot retry this under your laws, but if it's unfair, fundamentally unfair, the appellate court judge in France can change the decision, even though all the lawyers said there's no way you can win that because it was based upon a procedure issued by the lower court attorney. But I won that case and was able to send the case back for trial so she could get her trial in spite of the error of her lawyer.
You have taught at the University of Paris, but you also like to act, and you have a lead role in the dramatic play Bonhoeffer Last Days.
Yes.
What is that about?
I was in Manhattan for a dramatic reading with all professional actors. I'm the only one really not considered a professional actor, even though I have acted professionally in France. And when I was in law school in California, I would not be in New York for such a long period. My publisher is there, and I worked with my publisher, and I had author events, including the Union Square, Barnes & Noble, and that was fantastic. But I agreed to act in this play, Bonhoeffer Last Days, because, among other things, it addresses German activists who, in spite of the risk to his own life, helped us to save many Jews to Switzerland. During World War II, he was a German Lutheran minister, but he also worked with the German Secret Service equivalent to the Gestapo, who would send him out to places thinking he was spying for the Nazis, but he was really working for the German resistance. And the one thing that I do, since I've retired as a professor, I go to Beirut and work in the refugee camps with the Syrians and the Palestinians. I would be there now, but I made an exception to do this reading, to push this to off-Broadway, and one of the main things is the growing wave of anti-Semitism in the world. And this will remind people of what Jews have gone through. And, many Jews, they're not necessarily aligned with the right of the Israeli government. They want peace. They want to work with people. And I'm having Jewish roots and proud of them. But fundamentally, Jews are peace-loving and loving people. If you look at the Torah and so forth, and caring people. This wave of anti-Semitism is based on ignorance, but it's happening. So I agreed to be part of this play. It addresses growing tendencies for fascism because of what happened in World War II. And finally, Bonhoeffer, the guy I played, not only helped the Jews, but he also helped African Americans and worked in Harlem with Adam Clayton Powell, which is another theme. And I believe there's a growing wave of racism with respect to other ethnic groups as well. And so since this theme is manifested, I'm giving my time to this play, and it's a worthwhile play.
I want to thank you so very much for your concern and caring about human rights, environmental rights for all people, regardless of where they live. And I think it's remarkable that you have taken on the challenge to bring attention to problems that are so important to the survival of both people and the ecosystems. Thank you for being my guest.
I'm honored to be your guest, Nancy, and hopefully we'll meet, and hopefully you'll come to France.
I look forward to traveling to France, Israel, and other places to see the issues, see the problems, support the people and the ecosystems.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I have been speaking with Dr. Frank Romano, lawyer in both California and in France, activist, writer, actor, author of Love and Terror in the Middle East. I'm Nancy Pearlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Pearlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.